Firstly, can I ask you to switch on your cameras and mute your mics? That could be it. Sorry, that didn't work. That was my last joke, by the way, so I'm screwed apparently. All right, so my topic's a bit more serious. I think the topic before, the speaker before, was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And I would also come back to some of the economic implications of what he spoke of. But I think it's, you know, the title, you can't really talk about climate change without depressing half the audience. So there's a few things I should say at the start of this. We are the wealthiest generation in the history of the planet. There's never been a generation with the access to wealth that we have, the places we can go, the things we can eat, etc. We are also the healthiest generation in the history of the planet. There's never been a generation that will live as long as we will. The problem is that we might be the last generation with this level of wealth and health. And that's really what my presentation is about. It's talking about where the world's going. Is there some feedback? How do we solve that? How do we solve that? And that's really, a lot of my research is focused on that. That people think I'm all for the environment. I'm actually not, I'm all for people. Because if we want to exist in the future, we need to also solve some of the environmental problems around us. One of the biggest ones is climate change, and that's really what I would like to talk about. So, firstly, to the skeptics in the room, I would like to just post this little picture here. You know, if this is all a hoax, what if we create a better world for nothing? And I think that's really, when I talk about climate change, I'm going to show you some evidence of what's happening and why it's happening. But there are always a few people in the room that feel that it's not happening. And if I was in a classroom, I would have quickly done a Zoom poll, but now we're in real life, thank goodness. But the idea is not really to go into that argument, because it's a little bit like COVID. It's been proven over and over by the scientists what's happening. And what's interesting is that polls in the US show that around 65% of people believe that climate change is happening. And in the scientific world, it's 99.9%, and the other 1% or 0.1% aren't actually climate scientists. So this is kind of the departure point. So let me just go back to this question about, you know, is climate change happening? And really admitting that there's a problem is the start of the whole thing. And by the way, I should have also started by opening and saying I really love the fact that Impact is having this conference. At the business school that I'm at, it's all around that a business that doesn't make the world better shouldn't exist. And I think the things that Impact is doing and the fact that you're having this conference is fantastic. So I hope that in your conversations today and tomorrow, you would be able to go back to some of the things I would say. Some of it is related to climate change, but I'm actually also going to talk a lot about what can be done about climate change. So in terms of, is this a real problem? Well, as this diagram shows you, there's quite a few models that we can use for that. The ones that is often used is the top one. If you look at the names there, on the, I think there's a laser on here, that Hadkrit's model is the one that's most used in different modeling frameworks, and I'll also come back to that model, I think, in the slide after this or somewhere. Now, I think most of you would know that some of the hottest temperatures that we've had, I think of the 20 most, or the hottest years in the history of the planet, 17 of those have been in the last 20 years. So it's really a big crisis for us. We're seeing major shifts. This is from 1850. I will show you some data that goes back longer, but not related to temperature, but more towards carbon dioxide. But you can see that the temperatures, if we just take pre-industrial, and that's usually the base that we work from, pre-industrial temperatures, we've had an increase of about 1 to 1.2, 1.3% or degrees Celsius increase since 1850. And that's quite a substantial change. Now, the problem is not really just that it's changed, that the graph has shifted. And this is very statistical, but you can see there's a few normal curves superimposed on each other. And those of you that's gone through the MBA program at Stellenbosch would know that, you know, there's a lot of stats. So Jako, some nightmare material back for you. But you can see there from 1921 what the normal curve looked like. And more recently, in 1920, 2011 to 2015. So this is McKinsey data. So again, it's not a WWF graph. This is a consulting firm that's reputable for business. So it's not Mickey Mouse stuff that's happening here. But what I would like you to see is that the normal curve had moved to the right, and of course that coincides with what I said earlier. But not only that, the base of the normal curve has broadened. So there's a name for that, I can't remember. I think it's not heteroscedasticity, but it's something else. But the normal deviation, or the normal standard deviation, has shifted, where it's much more likely for temperatures to go to those extremes. So even though average temperatures have moved, it's now that we don't have 1 or 2 degrees move from that average, we have now 5 degrees move from those averages. And that's when we have these, what's referred to as extreme weather events. Now, South Africa is fortunate, and I will come back to this, that we're actually less prone to extreme weather events. That's something that you have closer to the equator, and therefore we are more prone to the average moving than those extreme events, which is good news for insurance companies, but it's bad news for labor. Because if your average temperature moves, then people get hot, they don't want to work that much, etc., and that's a different problem. Now, while I've been speaking, you would also have seen this little wheel on the side showing temperatures and how it moves from the middle or pre-industrial, and you can see that it now restarted from 1850, and you can see how that graph goes out and out and out. And what you would also see is that it's been accelerating as it's reached the outer limit of that graph, which is terrible news for us, because it means not only is the climate changing, but the climate is changing faster. So, what is causing this? Firstly, we know it's happening. Secondly, what's causing this? And it all comes back to greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases, there's a few of them. The one that we all know about is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is very much associated with economic activity. So when an economy grows, it also is growing its carbon dioxide emissions. We can decouple that through energy efficiency and other energy sources, and that's fortunately happening a lot more than it did in the past. But what you see here is basically going back 800,000 years, and that's how far we can measure. So you often hear people say, yeah, but it's been hot before, and carbon dioxide, it's not been the case. So this is from, what they do is they drill into ice, and where they reach ice, the bottom of the ice is where they can measure the carbon dioxide. Now, if they reach the bottom, it means that before there wasn't ice. So we can measure as far along as when ice started. So carbon dioxide is good for the atmosphere. Without that, we would basically be freezing. The problem is that if we have too much of it, and that's what's currently happening. We're having too much of it. Now, there are other greenhouse gases as well. Methane is one, and I'll come back to methane, but methane is bad. That's why we like burning methane, because if you see on this table, just there's a little heading over there that says CO2e, that's CO2 equivalent. So one molecule of methane is equivalent to 23 times as much carbon dioxide. So if we burn one methane, it basically means that we can reduce emissions 23 times. And that's why we just flare methane. Now, this is just a quick science explanation. If you're wondering why that is, it's just because of the shape of the molecule. If you remember from your science in school, and I'm not meaning to give anyone any nightmares yet, but carbon dioxide looks like that. It's symmetrical and it's got a double bond, so the molecule, when it heats, it vibrates, but it can vibrate very little. Methane, on the other hand, I've got a carbon with 4 hydrogens, which means it's very light, it's very lightly held, so it can vibrate a lot. And that's why we can store more energy in methane than in carbon dioxide. So this is just a quick science lesson. So the next question is this anthropogenic? Now, anthropogenic is just a fancy word of saying, is it human-made? But I thought it would look impressive to have that on the screen. So are we responsible? And really, this graph should put your mind at ease that yes, it's us. And the blue line on here shows natural factors. So if we just trusted nature, you can see that that line increases very, very slowly, and I'll come to that. So yes, nature is responsible for some of the climate change that we're seeing, but most of it is human-made, and that's the red line that you can see, that's anthropogenic factors. So that's us putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, it's a matter of, as the heading says, the camel's back. And if you're wondering what broke the camel's back, well, this will tell you the answer. So on the top side, you can see these are emissions that are emitted, and the bottom side of it is where it goes. So it either can go into trees or into the ocean. So any shellfish, like a mussel, the shell is made from calcium carbonate, so it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So those act as sinks, and that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But the rest of it goes into the atmosphere. And we've been, for many, many decades, been pumping in more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than what nature can absorb. Now, there's a bit of a, it's not on yet, but there on the land side, if we can show you on this side as well, there you'll see that the land sink for the last few years actually does not tend downwards anymore. It's actually switching up, and that is something to be super concerned about, because it means that nature has lost its ability to act as a sink, and it's for a number of reasons. Well, firstly, there's deforestation, but that turn that you see there is not because of deforestation. It means that the plant life can't survive anymore when it gets hotter, and when plant life can't survive, the plants die, it makes methane, and now we get a snowball effect. So if it's not clear yet, we're in deep shit. So it's us. So what is the impact? Now I'm moving along fairly quickly. I hope I reach half an hour. But what is the impact of this? Well, firstly, there are primary and secondary impacts. Now, the primary ones is just scientifically, it's higher temperatures. It's also rising minimum temperatures, which means that the whole curve is moving upwards, which is good news if you are probably, in the north of England. You'll have a nicer climate soon, but it's for the majority of the world, it's bad news. Not only does it get hotter, as I said earlier, there are also more extreme events. So a country like England, even though it would be more pleasant, they will have more extreme events, which you then have in terms of floods, heat waves, etc. So rising sea levels, and I'll come to that just now, higher ocean temperatures, which brings us back to shellfish. That when you've got ocean heating, then the corals die, and then we've got what we call coral bleaching. So it means that the coral is a symbiotic relationship between the coral itself and a little small animal that live with it. And when it gets really hot, the coral think it's the animal that's causing it, and it kicks out the animal, and then that's when the coral goes absolutely white. And a year later, it's absolutely grey. So I scuba dive, and it's really devastating. A few years ago, I went to the Red Sea, and really, like half the Red Sea coral is gone. Now, it can regrow after a while, but if you have this 3-4 years in a row, it's just every time that what had grown, it's getting destroyed. Now, there is some good news. We can grow coral artificially. We can also grow coral that can withstand heating of the oceans, but you can imagine, we can't do that much about it. It's really a big problem. The one thing that I did want to point out here is that I've put thawing permafrost at the bottom. So permafrost is, if you think about the north parts of Russia, we've got methane that's captured in the ice. So that's permafrost. And it happened because you had rotten material, and then the ice formed over it, so now the methane is captured in it. And what's happening currently is we are starting to, because of global warming, the ice is melting, which releases methane into the atmosphere, and we're back at the snowball effect I spoke of earlier. So it's really a bad place that climate is at the moment. There's fair certainty about which direction it's going. And when I say fair, that's the problem always when people say, how you climate scientists aren't sure. It's because in any science, there's always a probability that you're wrong. If we say all swans are white, what if one black swan shows up? So there's also that little thing, and those of you that's been in science before would understand that. So there are secondary effects based on the changes in climate. Now, biodiversity losses is an obvious one. Insects in particular are very sensitive, so we've lost in the last 30 years, this is not a stat that I have on my slides, but in the last 30 years we've lost 70% of insect species. And so it means that there are parts of the world where we don't have bees. Now that's also for other reasons than just climate change, but it's really bad news also for the food industry. Human health and mortality. There's a number of things that happen with us when we get hotter. Our livers start failing. We get heart attacks. Most of it is heart related. So that's a big thing also that's happening currently. We get lower agricultural yields, extreme weather, although South Africa is not exposed so much to that extreme weather aspect. Tourism gets impacted, and that's why if you go to big climate talks, there's a conference of parties coming up in November, where all the world's countries talk about climate change, and the small islands, those are the ones that are the most concerned, because they exist for tourism. They have to stop climate change, but at the same time, flying to them contributes to climate change. You can see the catch-22 that they're in. And then the economic impact. So I'll talk a little bit about the economic impact, and as well as others. So this is from Swiss Re. Now, if you've never heard of Swiss Re before, I'm sure most of you have, but Swiss Re is a reinsurance company. They're the insurance company of insurance companies. So when a few years ago there was a massive hailstorm in Sandton, everyone that was parked on the road or were in peak traffic, and a hailstorm came and they bumped holes in all of the Porsches and Mercedeses. So then the insurance company has to pay out. But that's a massive blow for an insurance company, so then they have an insurance company, and that's Swiss Re. So as you can guess, Swiss Re has got some of the best data about climate and what's happening, and this is just a graph showing man-made versus natural disasters. And the blue graph shows the man-made, and the more reddish, pinkish color is natural disasters. And you can see more natural disasters happening every year. And it's not a matter of the quantum of the loss, because that's also increasing, because we're building, Vodacom is building telecom towers and things like that. So things that are both more sensitive for weather, but also worth more. So this is just to show that, yes, we are seeing more of these incidents, more extreme weather, etc. I spoke about sea level rise. If you're wondering about that, well, up to now we've seen rises of about 30 centimeters in most countries. I think a lot of you are from Cape Town, but if you go to Globerg, you'll see that some of the houses built on the front of the beach actually has built a wall in front of them, because over the last few years, the sea has come across there more and more often. Now, this is one of the fields that there's fair uncertainty about, because what you see of the ice caps is what's on top of the water, and of course, as you know, there's a lot more below it. Some of it is just floating, so in fact, if it melts, it doesn't. If you have an ice block in your glass, when it melts, the water doesn't go up because the ice block was floating in it, so it actually stays the same. But other parts is actually fixed to the earth itself. When that melts, it leads to a rise. So estimates are anything from what we have currently up to 3 meters. Now, that means nothing for someone in Johannesburg. It does mean a lot for people in Durban, in Port Elizabeth, Cape Town, where actually large parts, for instance, the whole of the waterfront is gone if we have a meter rise in sea levels. The impact on GDP. Now, this is again, economic models, and I've tried to highlight just one thing because it can be a very busy slide. But what you see here is on the top, kind of what scenarios we aim at. And usually what we try to say is, let's try and keep it below 2 degrees Celsius. So we're already at the 1.6 at the moment, or 1.3. We have given up on 1.5. Now we're aiming for 2. And that's the Paris Agreement. So if you've heard of the Paris Agreement, spoke of COP, just the one that's coming up every year. So a few years ago, we had the Paris Agreement at the COP that was in Paris. And at that, they agreed that every country will say, I will do this much, I will do that much. Now, apart from the fact that very few countries actually pledged enough to keep us to this target, it's not enough. It's not going to get us there. So the scenarios you see at the top, so well below 2 degrees Celsius, and what impact that would have on the African and Middle Eastern economic growth. So we're looking at a loss of, or a decline of about 5%, which doesn't sound as much when you look at it in isolation, because if everyone is poorer, we don't really mind. But what you will see is that, well, basically we are the second worst off. The only part is the East Asian areas that is worse off, because it's also a lot of islands, etc. But it means that just climate change is causing an increase in inequality in the world. And with inequality, you have social instability. So there are those things also that we should be concerned about. The Swiss Re has got an index. They call it, in the right-hand column, you'll see Climate Economics Index, and it measures a number of things. And again, it's extremely busy, so therefore, hence the blue arrow that shows South Africa in number 35. So we are number 35 in terms of ability to adjust. That's really what we say. Now, there are three columns that is important in terms of the risk aspect. So chronic risk just means if average temperatures go up, what's going to happen? And that's really where we do very poorly. So we are 37th in that respect. This is a country like Finland, which is the best, and Denmark. And I mentioned earlier, if it gets hotter there, it's actually just more pleasant for them, so they don't really care about that. We do care about that because it impacts productivity. If it gets as hot here as it is in Dubai, we'll battle to work. But what the good news is, in fact, South Africa is number one. We're the least sensitive to heat-related extreme events. So it gets really hot, but we're used to it. Part of the answer is that it's going to be hot always. So even when there are extreme events, it's not that much different from just getting much hotter. The same thing with the wet climate risk score. So extreme wet events also in South Africa is less prone to happen. And then I think this is something that Rudolf would have liked, but the fact that our country doesn't actually have the capacity to adjust. And that's a lot to do with infrastructure. It's got to do with the fact that a lot of our people live in shacks, and RDP house is also not built for these kind of hot events. So do we have the capacity to adapt? Now, I've used that word now. You've got climate mitigation, which is you try to prevent climate change, and then you've got climate adaptation. And climate adaptation is pretty much what we need to do in Africa, because there's not much we can do about mitigation, really. So the impact on industries, and I'm going to, rather than look at the graph on the left, because that just is a lot of numbers, and it shows you that energy and materials and utilities will experience a big drop in their production numbers or in their revenue. But the graph on the right, or the figure on the right, is something that's maybe more interesting. And that shows a matrix that shows risk and opportunity. So on the vertical, opportunity, that's low and high. On the horizontal axis, low and high risk. And as you would imagine, on the right-hand bottom corner, you've got, and this is a graph, just a small document I wrote for the Western Cape government at some point. When 2018, the droughts happened, which industries is in trouble, which ones aren't, and what can be done about it. And this was an interesting exercise. As you would imagine, car washes couldn't open, so they experienced a decline. But things like fresh flowers declined. People didn't want to buy fresh flowers because, well, it takes water to make them, and then you also have to put them in water, and now you have to decide whether to keep your flowers or to drink your water, and it becomes difficult. On the demand up, the left-hand top one is also not too difficult to guess. So desalination went up, water-wise appliances, grey water systems, etc. Also water-wise gardening, which is actually something that we got from California because they experienced this shift before we did. But the interesting thing is actually that none of those two quadrants is the one that's interesting. The one that's interesting is the top right-hand one, the transform. And that's also when you have a conference now about a company that's been very progressive. I really like the examples that Loki gave about the products that you've had. In fact, Sarita Olivier, I know her because she was a student of ours. She phoned me a few weeks ago and I asked her, well, while I have you on the phone, where can I get a composter? So it's just so happened that on Monday last week I got my composter from the city of Cape Town. So, but a company like Impact, which is quite progressive and innovative, to have a conference like that puts you into this quadrant to say what aspects of our business is exposed to risk, which aspects of the business is exposed to opportunity, and what can we do to really convert that. So electric vehicles, for instance, falls into the automobile space, but also the shared economy, shared ownership, the circular economy, all of those things fall into that quadrant. So what can we do? Well, in terms of the science, what we're doing currently isn't working. So this comes from the most recent UNFCCC report, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is a direct quote from that. They said that, actually the gap of what we should be doing in terms of carbon dioxide is just broadening and not narrowing. So all these climate change talks we're having every year, it's not had the right effect. So I don't think the solution lies within government. I don't actually think that government is the right unit of analysis, if I can put it that way. It's not the right place to think about this. Well, I think one of the things that we should be looking at is population. Fortunately, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is that since 1970, which is roughly when I was born, we've doubled the world's population. At the same time, can anyone guess what happened with meat consumption? Population doubled, so what do you think happened with meat consumption? Doubled as well? It tripled. So we're eating more meat and not less, contrary to what most people would think. And also, I think Rudolph made the point about a bigger middle class. When people rise in income, we eat more meat. And that's kind of a fact of life. It is something that we can work on, but it's unlikely that we can really expect people to do that for the same reason as what Rudolph said. That how do you tell someone that now is newly rich while you can't have the riches that someone else had, which have been rich for a long time? And that's a dilemma that I often see in the classroom as well. When I start talking about this, people say, but hang on, that's really hypocritical of you. That's the bad news. The good news is that while our population growth globally is 0.1%, which means that people don't have that many children, and a lot of this is ironically driven in China, and ironically also from single children that decide, well, I want to remain single because this is nice. And I've had that experience. I've also made the point about biodiversity. I said insects are down 30% or 70% in the last 30 years. Mammals in the last 50 years also down by 70%. So we are a lot more people, a lot less natural animals, but still the number of chickens, pork, cattle, sheep outstrip humans by about factors 3.1 on any given day in the world. So there are three times more animals grown for meat than there are people. So it doesn't make sense. I eat meat, by the way, so I acknowledge that I am hypocritical in saying that. This is an interesting statistic because with population, if we say, we're not going to solve population overnight, yes, population growth is 0.1%, but people also live a lot longer. So just by the fact that people live longer, we've seen an increase of 20% in populations. So it's also to do with how we consume. So this is a really, really interesting metric. It's called Country Overshoot Day, and it roughly works like this. Imagine that the natural environment is a savings account and it earns interest. So whatever you've got 100 fish in a pond, every year there will be 20 more fish if you just leave it. So there's interest of 20% on your fish pond every year. Nature globally has got interest every year, so that's the amount of natural resources that gets regenerated every year that if we just live from that, we can sustain ourselves. The question is then, at what point in the year, and we're past the point of consuming more than what the world generates every year, so the question is, at what point do we exceed that point for the world or for South Africa? Have any of you found South Africa yet?
Yes,
4th of July. So right at the bottom there. So by the 4th of July, South Africa has used all of the natural resources that will be replenished. And what you're doing is for the rest of the year, you're eating into your savings account. Now, as savings accounts go, if you don't know this, but if you eat into your savings account, next year the interest is even less than what it was this year. So we are eating quicker into our savings account. So every year, the last time that we were at a zero budget, that we were at a negative, or let's say a neutral cash flow, if we can refer to it in financial terms, was ironically in 1970, so 50 years ago. We consumed as much as the world gives us. So consumption is definitely a problem. And this is problematic for people in business, and I'm at a business school. I know that businesses want to grow. And how do you grow a business if you can't make a product? You know, my dad was a mechanic. He said the biggest problem that Leyland did was they made a Land Rover that lasted forever. So you need to make something to break to be in business. And that's a big dilemma for business. It's solvable, and it's solvable by a concept called servitization. Servitization means I sell you hot water and I don't sell you a geyser. And then the incentive for me is to make a geyser that lasts forever. So maybe again, you know, coming back to impact, think about what that potentially how that could be applied to you. And I know that you can recycle and you bring back all those things. So what if we stop today emitting immediately? Let's go into lockdown immediately. No one's allowed to move anymore. I know it sounds familiar, but let's just do that exercise. What would happen? The sad news is that for at least another 50 to 100 years, we will just be on a steady climb in temperatures. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. I'm just stating to you that it's urgent that we do something, but we can't expect an overnight change. And this just shows that. This just shows future warming and what the different scenarios would look like. So practically, what can we do? Well, I mentioned lockdown. This is actually what happened during COVID. I'm asked this quite often. What was the impact on climate change of COVID? And the answer is we saw good news for a very short period, and in fact, shortly after that, we're right back where we started, which also resonates with what Rua said earlier. So the things that made that graph come down are things like power consumption. So production dropped because people didn't consume that much anymore. Ground transport dropped massively. Air transport doesn't even feature on here. So despite, you know, air travel is actually still the most efficient way of moving people across a wide area. But it doesn't mean that we should fly that much, but still. So this is kind of just at a very practical level what we can do. So firstly, we can change behavior. So behavioral changes in scientific terms are the easiest. They're also the most difficult. Because if you look at why people behave, it's mostly belief or values that they hold. And those are things that are really difficult to change. If someone doesn't, and we see this with COVID, people try to reinforce, if I don't want to be vaccinated, I will find a reason not to be vaccinated. And the harder you try, the more reasons I will find not to. So we're not going to change people by me telling you, you need to change your ways. It's something that people need to decide for themselves. So even though behavioral changes are super obvious, and to make them is easy, but it's actually first convincing people that they should be doing it. Now, in energy terms, a very quick behavioral change, and I'm just using this as an illustration, is turning off a switch. When you leave the room, switch off the light. That's a behavioral change. It's very easy to do, but getting people to actually do it, I've got kids, extremely difficult. But at the bottom, I think you're familiar with the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle, and a number of other R's added in there. Refusing, repairing, and repurposing is some of those. And again, coming back to impact, I think you're in the industry of dealing with people's waste, transporting people's waste in wheelie bins and all of those things. So I think you can play an active role here. Once you've switched off the light, you've done what you could, but once you're in the room, we need light. So what we look at then is we look at efficiency. So So there's another R in there. We redesigned our way of using that. Now, what's important is efficiency doesn't imply a drop in the comfort level. So we still want the same level. Otherwise, it's not efficiency. It's back to behavioural change. So in terms of showering, if we think of water again, behavioural change is taking a shorter shower, and efficiency change is changing the shower head. And so going from incandescent to CFL to LED lights is a good example. And then the last way of reducing your carbon emissions or your footprint, and it could also be another footprint like plastic or something like that, is offsetting. Now, I remember when I was in university, I came from a middle-class family, so if I wanted to take my girlfriend on the weekend to a fancy restaurant, I had to eat cream crackers. I'm not sure how many of you remember them, but I had to eat cream crackers in the week in order to spend elsewhere. And that's exactly what offsetting means. Offsetting means that we reduce emissions elsewhere so that we can increase at another place. And the equivalent of that is just buying renewable energy, or planting a tree, or buying carbon offsets. So these are at a very practical level. I'm not talking about policy and the government stuff. This is physically what we can do. Now, this is the last aspect that I want to bring in, but why would companies act? And the answer is fairly simple. I would, again, in the classroom environment, have taken some answers from the audience. But why would companies act? And the answer to that is just threefold. Well, firstly, because it's the right thing to do. But not many companies do the right thing because they believe it's the right thing. And in my own experience, the only companies that really get that right are companies that are owner-driven, that the CEO is also the owner, where it's no longer a company that I'm managing on behalf of someone. It's my company, and what my company is doing is screwing up the environment. That's the biggest form of ownership that you will see, and that's the moral reason. So the moral reason can also be driven by employees, by customers, by financiers, etc. But if high-level leadership doesn't buy into that, and again, it's why this conference is really great to see, because it means the top leadership takes on this challenge and want to do something about it. But the other two reasons is around legitimacy and the financial business case, or the strategic reason if you want. So legitimacy just is the license to operate. Do we believe that the company should exist? So if you think about Volkswagen, when they had the ClimateGate scandal, where they lied about the emissions on their cars, people stopped buying Volkswagen for a short while after that. We're kind of back where we were before, but the market does punish you. But for fuel companies, for fossil fuel companies, you see that punishment more pervasively and more consistently. So in some countries where you've got big mining industries, like Ghana for instance, if you pollute in the river, the chief can tell you, move away, we don't want you here anymore. So it's physically, you lose your license to be in that country. Standards can do a similar thing. So tires, the rolling resistance of the tire on a car must be at a certain level for you to be access to sell the tire. So that's another way of access to the market. The third one is the financial or the strategic reason, and I will talk about that just now. So the risk view, and I think this is my third last slide. The risk view, if we talk about doing something about climate change, the starting point for me, usually, if I have to speak to a senior management team or someone, is the risk view, because that's the easiest one to sell. People are risk averse. If you've read the work of Daniel Kahneman, if you say to people, you can either win this or lose this, and it's exactly the same thing, but you're just switching it as a risk, they're much more prone to buy from you if you sell it as a risk. So selling climate change as a risk is the starting point. Physical risks, I've shown you about that. Litigation risk is an example of Volkswagen. Reputational risk is a company like, for instance, Shell, which also contributes to climate change, so the reputation is quite vulnerable to this. And then there's, on the other side of this, more regulatory risk, where government forces you to do something, and if you're not in a position, think about asbestos, for instance. Many years after asbestos has been phased out, we still get companies, or we had companies that were sued for it. And then the last one, competitiveness. That climate change could make you less competitive. Now, if you think about a company like Tesla, for instance, and the market cap they have, that's the positive side of it. And again, you're framing it as a positive rather than a negative, sometimes makes sense. So, on the level of competitiveness, we can think about value creation and being a sustainable company, and in the term of impact, you have to think about a company in terms of what they're doing today and what they're doing tomorrow. You can't just focus on tomorrow, because you might actually go out of business today. Simon Susman, the chairman of Woolworths, a while back, I heard him say that you have to be in front of the market, but not so far that you lose them. And that's really, you have to be sustainable today while focusing on tomorrow. And then internal versus external, it's fine doing everything inside right, but if you also not communicate that to your stakeholders and outside, then that's a problem. So these 4 quadrants looks at, so if we talk about pollution prevention, which is internally today, that's what we do in the business to reduce our footprint. At the same time, the outward-facing part, this is how people see your company, and how do they see you today. And that's all about product stewardship. Is your product good for the environment? It's all about reputation. If you do not manage that side well, people will stop buying from you because they think you shouldn't exist because you're a bad company. The third one, and I think that's really where this conference is positioning itself, is the idea around the sustainability vision. And that's, what will the world of 20 years from now need? And how can you have that product ready for them? And there are companies in the world that understand this really well, and DuPont, for instance, is just a company that does that really well. Saying, if we look at our stakeholders, and it's a little bit more towards the kind of blue ocean strategy aspect of how to compete where there is no product yet, to preempt what the market will need. And then the last one is around clean tech, which is more facing internally, but what we will need in the future. So the last slide just brings us back to the moral reason. And I think this is the start of everything, that unless you do something, unless you as a person decide something needs to happen, probably nothing will happen. I've been with many environmental initiatives, and if there's not a champion, if there's not someone that's really passionate, that's willing to walk the extra mile, well, nothing happens on this. So this is one of my favorite sayings: there's no such thing as an ex-environmentalist. Once you've crossed that barrier, you can't really go back and say, well, I don't care anymore. And hopefully, with 1 or 2 of the slides, I made you slightly concerned. With 1 or 2 of you, I may have changed you to an environmentalist, and then I would have succeeded. Thank you very much. Okay, I see a question. What is your view on clean energy versus South Africa's coal reserves versus unemployment versus Eskom? As a developing country, should we be part of COP22? I'm not sure, is it not COP20? I think we're farther than 22, but I may be wrong. That's an interesting question. It's really an interesting question, and it's one that I cannot unequivocally answer around job creation, because I think clean energy is often punted as a job creator, as a net generator, but that also assumes that you would produce some of the technology in your own country. My personal feeling, my personal view is that we don't have the capacity to generate or to build that in South Africa. The Chinese is far more efficient than we are at building solar panels. We should rather just buy the panels, implement them, and become the exporter of energy. And you've seen Elon Musk as well talking about this more recently. Africa has got plenty of natural resources, and I don't talk about the trees, I'm talking about the sun. If we convert that into hydrogen, and we can transport hydrogen, which is different to electric vehicles because batteries are heavy, etc. So yeah, there's a lot in there, even though I think for the transport problem in South Africa, electric vehicles is the solution. I think storing our energy in hydrogen makes a lot of sense. It's very easy technology, it's very safe, so it shouldn't be a problem. Ironically, I think the CEO of Eskom is quite prone to renewable energy, contrary to what a lot of the previous CEOs have done or said. And I think that's the right thing. If you look at the 10 biggest utilities in the world, I think 9 of them, of which Eskom is one, 9 of them are now more into renewable energy than anything else. And Eskom is the only laggard. So in fact, we are actually falling behind because we're not investing in it. There's an argument that renewable energy is more expensive than coal energy. That's true. But it's only true if you don't consider new energy build. So Medupi is already 4 times more expensive than what your renewable energy on average is. So if we build new energy, it should be renewable. Yes, we still have coal. We still have coal for another 400 years. We just can't afford to burn it. And you often see that in the market valuations of fossil fuel companies. Sasol is doing well because I think Sasol is very progressive. Sasol realizes that the fossil fuel game is running out. So they're working really hard to find alternatives. And I hope they will. Any other questions? Sounds like the end of it. Thank you very much.